Every empire in human history eventually ended. That is not an opinion. That is the single most consistent fact in the entire recorded story of human civilization. You can test it against any empire you can name. The Roman Empire, which gave the Western world its laws, its roads, its language, and its calendar, gone. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire ever assembled in history. An empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the doorstep of Western Europe, gone in less than 200 years. The British Empire, which once planted its flag on every continent, controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface, and commanded a navy that could project force to any ocean on the planet, gone. Every single one of them gone. And yet, one empire defied that pattern. One empire built not by a great civilization with centuries of accumulated power, not by a technologically superior culture with overwhelming military advantage, but by a small, semi-nomadic Turkish tribe from a narrow strip of land in northwestern Anatolia. Lasted 600 years. 600 years. To put that number in perspective, the United States of America, the most powerful nation in modern history, is not yet 250 years old. The entire history of the United States fits inside the Ottoman Empire's run more than twice, with room to spare. The Ottoman Empire was founded around 1299. It did not formally end until 1922. It governed territory on 3 continents. It administered dozens of languages, hundreds of ethnic groups, and 3 of the world's major religions simultaneously. It produced 36 sultans across an unbroken dynastic line. It survived civil wars, plagues, military defeats, economic crises, and the complete restructuring of global trade. It survived the rise of the printing press, the gunpowder revolution, the age of exploration, the industrial revolution, and 2 centuries of European imperial expansion. And now here is the question that should stop you cold. Why? Why did this particular empire, not Rome, not the Mongols, not the British, not the Chinese Han dynasty, why did this one last longer than all of them in the modern era? What did they know that every other empire failed to figure out? What did they build that was so structurally different, so fundamentally more resilient, that it took the combined force of a world war to finally bring it down? Here is what most people get wrong about the Ottoman Empire. They think it survived because of its military. It didn't. Armies can always be beaten. History is full of undefeated armies that belong to empires that collapsed anyway. Military power is real, but it is temporary. It depreciates. It gets outflanked, outgunned, or simply exhausted. The Ottoman Empire survived because of something far more durable than any army. It survived because of a set of ideas about how to hold human beings together. People who did not share the same language, the same faith, the same customs, or the same history, without destroying what made each of them who they were. That idea, that administrative philosophy, took 600 years to unravel, and we are still living in the world it left behind. This is the story of how it began, what it built, how it adapted, and why it finally ended. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, and the answer to the most underrated question in the history of human civilization. To understand why the Ottoman Empire rose, you have to understand what the world looked like in the late 1200s. Because the Ottoman story does not begin with triumph. It begins with catastrophe. It begins with a world that had just been shattered. In 1258, the Mongol armies of Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad, the intellectual and political capital of the Islamic world for 500 years. The House of Wisdom, which had preserved and advanced the sum of human knowledge through centuries when Europe was in its darkest age, burned. The Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic center of Sunni Islamic civilization, destroyed. Historians recorded that the Tigris River ran black with ink from the manuscripts that were thrown into it, and red with the blood of the scholars who tried to save them. The psychological and political impact of that moment across the Islamic world cannot be overstated. It was not simply a military defeat. It was the collapse of a civilizational framework. The Eastern Islamic world entered a period of profound disorientation, politically leaderless, spiritually shaken, and geographically fragmented in ways that would take generations to resolve. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the peninsula that bridges Europe and Asia, the land that is modern-day Turkey, a different kind of collapse was underway. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had governed much of central Anatolia for nearly 2 centuries, was disintegrating. Weakened by internal succession disputes and devastated by Mongol pressure from the east, it was fracturing into a patchwork of small, competing principalities called beyliks. Each beylik was led by its own local lord. Each was struggling to survive. None had the resources, the territorial base, or the political authority to consolidate the others. To the west of these beyliks sat the Byzantine Empire, and if the Seljuks were disintegrating, Byzantium was something worse. It was a ghost pretending to be a body. The Byzantine Empire had once been the most sophisticated political entity in the Mediterranean world. At its height, Constantinople was the largest and most cosmopolitan city on earth. But by the late 1200s, Byzantium had been hollowed out from the inside. Decades of civil wars between rival dynastic claimants had consumed its treasury and fractured its administrative coherence. The catastrophic sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, carried out not by Muslims, but by fellow Christians from Western Europe, had broken something deep in the Byzantine spirit. The empire had recovered enough to reclaim its capital in 1261, but it had never recovered economically or strategically. It was now functionally dependent on Genoese and Venetian merchants for its trade revenues. Its military was a shadow. Its frontier defenses were increasingly porous. And along those porous frontiers, particularly in the borderlands of northwestern Anatolia, something new was forming. This borderland region, called the Frontier Zone, or in Turkish, the UC, was a place where Byzantine authority had essentially collapsed. It was inhabited by a mixture of nomadic Turkish groups moving westward from the Anatolian interior, Christian peasant communities who had been there for centuries, disaffected Byzantine border lords who had lost faith in Constantinople, and Muslim religious warriors called Ghatsis who saw the frontier as a zone of spiritual as well as military contest. Into this borderland, into this specific volatile, opportunity-rich environment, came Osman Bey and his tribe. Historians have debated for generations exactly how much we can know about Osman Bey, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. The sources from his lifetime are thin. Much of what was later written about him was retrospective, filtered through the mythology that any founding figure inevitably accumulates. But certain things are clear. Osman was the leader of a small Turkish tribal group, part of the K branch of the Oghuz Turks, that had settled in the region around Sagat in what is today northwestern Turkey. His father was Ertugrul. His people were frontier warriors, mobile, battle-hardened, and accustomed to operating in the ambiguous space between larger powers. What Osman was not, and this is important, was a religious visionary or a messianic figure. He was a pragmatist, a political operator, a man who understood his environment with uncommon clarity and made decisions accordingly. Consider his location. Osman's territory sat directly on the Byzantine frontier. That positioning was not incidental. It was strategically transformative. Because the Byzantine frontier was the place where ambitious Muslim warriors came to fight, where Byzantine landowners were looking for new political arrangements, and where the absence of any dominant power created space for a sufficiently organized and sufficiently flexible leader to grow. Osman understood this, and he made 3 decisions in the early years of his leadership that would define the Ottoman system for the next 6 centuries. The first decision was inclusion over exclusion. When Osman defeated Byzantine border lords, he did not always destroy them. He offered alliances. He accepted conversions, but he did not demand them. He incorporated Christian communities into his political orbit and gave them reasons to prefer his authority over a distant Byzantine emperor who could no longer protect them. This was not sentimentality. It was a calculated recognition that a diverse coalition was stronger than a homogeneous one. The second decision was meritocracy over bloodline. Osman distributed power and reward based on usefulness, not solely on family connection or tribal affiliation. Warriors who were effective got land. Administrators who were capable got authority. This drew talent toward him from across the region, from other Turkish groups, from Byzantine defectors, from anywhere that capable men were looking for a leader worth following. The third decision was legitimacy through law, not just force. From his earliest days as a ruler, Osman worked to establish a reputation for fair dealing and predictable governance. People who submitted to his authority knew what to expect. That predictability, that sense that the rules would be consistent, was profoundly attractive in a region where arbitrary violence and administrative chaos had become the norm. These three principles, inclusion, meritocracy, and rule-based governance, were not written down in a founding document. There was no Ottoman constitution in 1299, but they were embedded in the behavioral patterns of the early Ottoman state, and they were transmitted to every generation that followed. The year 1299 is conventionally given as the founding date of the Ottoman Empire, though historians note that this is a symbolic designation more than a precise historical event. What matters is not the date. What matters is the pattern that was being established in those years, a pattern of political behavior that was, for its time and place, genuinely unusual. Osman died around 1323 or 1324. He left his son, Orhan, a state that was still small by any imperial measure, but it was growing, and more importantly, it was organized. Orhan moved quickly to consolidate and expand. In 1326, his forces captured Bursa, a significant Byzantine city that became the first true Ottoman capital. This was not merely a military victory. It was a declaration of intent. Bursa had real urban infrastructure, markets, administrative buildings, a sophisticated population accustomed to urban governance. By making it his capital, Orhan signaled that the Ottoman project was not a raiding confederation. It was a state-building enterprise. Under Orhan, the Ottomans began to formalize the administrative structures that would define the empire. He appointed governors to manage territory rather than simply exploit it. He established early institutions of Islamic legal administration. He began the process of turning military conquest into lasting political architecture. And then, in 1354, something happened that changed the trajectory not just of the Ottoman state, but of European history. The Ottomans crossed into Europe, a combination of political opportunity and a devastating earthquake that damaged Byzantine fortifications gave Orhan's forces the opening they needed to establish a foothold at Gallipoli, the narrow peninsula that controls the passage between Europe and Asia. This was not a raid. This was a permanent settlement. The Ottomans had arrived on the European continent, and they had no intention of leaving. The crossing into Europe electrified the Islamic world and sent tremors of alarm through the Christian kingdoms of southeastern Europe. But the response from both directions fundamentally misread what was happening. European powers saw a military threat to be repelled. Islamic powers saw the frontier warrior state to be used as a buffer. Neither side understood that they were watching the birth of an institution, a genuine empire-building project that would outlast every political structure that then existed in the known world. Orhan's son, Murad I, took the Ottoman state to its next level of institutional development. Murad I is one of the most consequential rulers in world history and one of the least celebrated. Under his leadership from 1362 to 1389, the Ottomans transformed from an expanding frontier state into something that genuinely deserved the word empire. Murad conquered Adrianople, which the Ottomans called Edirne, in 1369 and made it the new Ottoman capital, placing the administrative heart of the empire firmly on European soil. He pushed deeper into the Balkans, bringing Bulgaria, parts of Serbia, and Macedonia into the Ottoman orbit. He did not conquer these territories through massacre and terror alone. He incorporated local Balkan nobility into the Ottoman administrative structure, gave them titles and land rights, and demanded loyalty and military service in return. He was building a multi-ethnic, multi-religious governance system in real time across a continent he had only recently arrived in. Murad also began the institutional innovations that Act 2 of this story will examine in depth. the early structures that would become the Devshirme system and the Janissary Corps. He understood, with a clarity that was rare for any ruler of his era, that the greatest long-term threat to his empire was not an external enemy. It was the internal fragmentation that came from relying too heavily on any single group's loyalty. He died at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, assassinated by a Serbian nobleman in the moments after an Ottoman victory. It was a death that should have destabilized everything. It did not, because by 1389, the Ottoman state was already larger than any single man. Murad's son Bayezid I was brilliant, ambitious, and catastrophically overconfident. He earned the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his military campaigns. He tightened the siege around Constantinople. He crushed a massive crusader army at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. He pushed Ottoman power in every direction simultaneously. And then he made the mistake of provoking Timur. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, was the last of the great Central Asian conquerors in the tradition of Genghis Khan. He had already destroyed Delhi, sacked Baghdad, devastated Syria, and built a pyramid of skulls outside every city that resisted him. He was not a man to antagonize. Bayezid did it anyway, sheltering Timur's enemies, engaging in provocative correspondence, behaving as if Ottoman military power placed him beyond consequences. At the Battle of Ankara in 1402, Timur delivered a verdict. His army annihilated the Ottoman forces. Bayezid I was captured in battle, the first Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner by an enemy. He died in captivity months later. What followed was 11 years of civil war. Bayezid's sons fought each other across the full breadth of Ottoman territory. The empire that had seemed so unstoppable fractured into competing factions. European powers celebrated. Byzantium breathed again. The consensus view in 1402 and 1403 was that the Ottoman experiment was finished. It was not finished, and here's why that matters so profoundly. The Ottoman Empire recovered from the catastrophe of Ankara not because a single great savior emerged, though Mehmed I, who reunified the empire between 1413 and 1421, was a capable ruler. It recovered because the institutions Osman, Orhan, and Murad had built were more resilient than any individual leader. The administrative structures kept functioning at the local level even as the dynastic center collapsed. The provincial governors who had been trained in the Ottoman system kept governing. The legal frameworks held. The economic relationships persisted. The loyalty structures that had been built through inclusion and meritocracy proved stronger than the military force that had temporarily destroyed the Sultan. This is the first great lesson of the Ottoman story, and it is a lesson that most empires never learned in time. Durability is not a product of military power. It is a product of institutional design. An empire that depends on the genius of its current leader is only as strong as that leader. An empire that has built systems for governance, systems for elite formation, systems for integrating diversity, is strong in a completely different way. It is strong in the way that a living organism is strong, capable of healing, capable of adaptation, capable of surviving damage that would kill a more rigid structure. The Ottomans survived Ankara because they had already built something that transcended Bayezid, something that could survive his defeat and his death. They had built a state that was bigger than any one man. That capacity to build institutions that outlast individuals is what would sustain the Ottoman Empire for the next 5 centuries. It is what took it from a small tribal confederation on the Byzantine frontier to the most enduring empire of the modern era. And understanding how they built it, the actual machinery of it, the deliberate, sophisticated, sometimes morally complex mechanisms of it, that is where the story goes next. Every empire that has ever existed has faced the same fundamental problem, not military conquest. That is the beginning, not the challenge. The challenge comes after the conquest. The challenge is this. How do you hold it together? How do you govern millions of people across thousands of miles? People who do not share your language, your faith, your customs, or your loyalties, and make them function as a single coherent political entity year after year, generation after generation, without it all falling apart from the inside. This is the question that has destroyed empires far more reliably than any external enemy ever has. Rome did not fall because the barbarians were unbeatable. Rome fell, in significant part, because its internal structures, its bureaucracy, its military loyalty systems, its elite formation pipelines, rotted from within over centuries, until the external pressure that any healthy empire could have absorbed became fatal. The Mongol Empire did not collapse because someone outfought it. It collapsed because Genghis Khan's heirs had no institutional framework for managing succession, no system for producing loyal administrators across conquered territories, and no mechanism for preventing the empire's own regional commanders from becoming independent warlords who serve themselves rather than the center. This is the pattern. It is almost universal. An empire conquers. It grows. Its administrative demands outpace its administrative capacity. Its elite class, initially loyal and capable, becomes hereditary and entrenched. Hereditary elites optimize for their own power, not the empire's stability. The center loses control of the periphery. The periphery fragments. And what began as an empire ends as a collection of competing successor states, each claiming the legacy of what came before, but none capable of sustaining it. The Ottomans understood this problem, not in the abstract, theoretical way that a historian looking backward understands it, but in the practical, visceral way that comes from watching neighboring states collapse around you and drawing the right conclusions about why. And they designed a solution that was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. Not perfect, not without moral complexity, not without its own internal contradictions that would eventually contribute to the empire's undoing, but extraordinary nonetheless, because it worked at a scale and for a duration that no comparable empire ever achieved. That solution had two interlocking components. The first was a system for producing loyal, capable elites from a source that was structurally immune to the hereditary entrenchment problem. The second was a military institution built on professional discipline, technological adaptability, and unit cohesion rather than feudal obligation. The first was the Devshirme. The second was the Janissaries. Together, they were the machinery that made the Ottoman Empire run. Imagine you are a sultan governing an empire that spans 3 continents. You need administrators. You need military commanders. You need governors for distant provinces, financial officers for a complex treasury, legal scholars for a multi-religious court system, and a personal guard that is absolutely, unconditionally loyal to you and not to any other power structure in the empire. Where do you find these people? You could draw from the existing Turkish Muslim nobility. But Turkish noble families have their own interests, their own tribal loyalties, their own dynastic ambitions. Give them too much power and they become rivals. Give them too little and they become resentful. Either way, you have created a class of people whose loyalty to the empire is conditional on their family's advantage. You could draw from the conquered populations. But conquered peoples carry the memory of their defeat. They have community loyalties, religious frameworks, and ethnic identities that compete with loyalty to the Sultan. Their first allegiance, in a crisis, is rarely to the state that conquered them. The Ottoman answer to this dilemma was so radical, so counterintuitive, and so systematically effective that it remains one of the most discussed administrative innovations in the history of political science. They built their elite from scratch. The Devshirme, the word means collection or gathering in Ottoman Turkish, was a system of periodic recruitment, typically conducted every 3 to 7 years, in which Ottoman officials traveled through the empire's Christian communities in the Balkans and occasionally Anatolia and selected boys. These boys, generally between the ages of 8 and 18, healthy, intelligent, and physically capable, were taken from their families, brought to Istanbul, converted to Islam, educated in the palace schools, and trained to serve the Sultan. They became, in the legal terminology of Ottoman law, the Sultan's slaves. Kul, the Sultan's men, his property, in formal terms, his most trusted servants and most powerful officials in practical reality. The Grand Vizier, the empire's chief minister, the second most powerful position in the Ottoman world, was for much of the empire's history a product of the Devshirme. So were the commanders of the Janissary Corps. So were the governors of major provinces. The men who ran the Ottoman Empire at its operational peak were, in the majority, men who had been taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans and remade through one of the most sophisticated educational pipelines in the pre-modern world into the instruments of Ottoman imperial power. Now, stop and consider what this actually accomplished from a systems design perspective. The Devshirme produced elites who had no family dynasty to protect. They had no tribal affiliation to prioritize. They had no ancestral land to defend. They had no brothers or cousins building parallel power structures. Their entire social identity, their entire network of relationships, their entire concept of self was constructed inside the Ottoman system and oriented entirely toward the Sultan. Their loyalty was not divided. It could not be divided because the system that created them had deliberately eliminated every alternative anchor of loyalty before they were old enough to have formed strong attachments elsewhere. This was the structural genius of it. Not just that these men were loyal, but that the design of the system made disloyalty structurally irrational. There was nowhere else to be loyal to. The palace schools where Devshirme recruits were educated were not merely military training camps. They were comprehensive institutions that produced genuinely educated, broadly capable human beings. Students learned Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish. They studied Islamic law, history, mathematics, and literature. They trained in physical disciplines, riding, archery, wrestling, swordsmanship. They were assessed continuously, and the most capable were advanced to increasingly prestigious tracks. The brightest and most capable might end up in the innermost circle of the palace, the Inderun School, which was essentially a training ground for the empire's senior leadership. The system was, by the standards of the pre-modern world, remarkably meritocratic. A boy taken from a Serbian peasant family in the Balkans could, through demonstrated ability and the favor of his superiors, rise to the position of Grand Vizier, the operational head of an empire governing 15 to 20 million people. And this was not theoretical. It happened, repeatedly. Some of the most capable Grand Viziers in Ottoman history, men like Ibrahim Pasha under Suleiman the Magnificent and the Koprolov family that essentially saved the empire in the 17th century, emerged from or were connected to the Devshirme pipeline. Now, the ethical dimension of this cannot simply be set aside. Boys were separated from their families. Families had no legal recourse. The communities from which these boys were taken did not consent to the arrangement in any meaningful sense of the word. The Devshirme was, at its core, a coercive institution. It was a form of forced conscription that operated on children, and the conversion to Islam that it required was not, by any modern standard, a free choice. The Ottoman state was aware of the coercive nature of the system, and it managed that awareness in a characteristically pragmatic way. It built in compensatory mechanisms. Families whose sons were taken were often exempt from certain taxes. Boys who rose to high positions could, and frequently did, maintain relationships with their families of origin, sometimes providing them with significant financial support. The communities from which the boys came developed complex relationships with the system. Some families attempted to hide their sons. Others attempted to ensure their sons were selected, recognizing that the Devshirme, as brutal as it was in its initial rupture, was also a pathway to power that was otherwise completely closed to Christian subjects. This complexity, the coexistence of coercion and opportunity, of violence and meritocracy, is not a contradiction that resolves neatly. It is a tension that sits at the heart of the Ottoman system and must be held in mind as we evaluate what the empire built. What it built operationally was an elite class that was simultaneously loyal, capable, and renewable. When a Grand Vizier died or was dismissed, the pipeline produced another. When a generation of Janissary commanders aged out, the system had already trained their replacements. The Ottoman imperial elite did not calcify into a hereditary aristocracy. because the system that produced it was specifically designed to prevent calcification. For roughly 2 centuries, from the mid-1300s through the mid-1500s, this design functioned with remarkable effectiveness. It was the deepest structural reason why the Ottoman state was able to recover from catastrophes like the Battle of Ankara, expand at the rate it did, and govern the extraordinary diversity of its population without constant administrative breakdown. The Devshirme produced the empire's administrators and commanders. The janissaries were what those commanders led, and they were something the medieval world had never quite seen before. The word janissary comes from the Ottoman Turkish yenikari, the new soldiers. They were founded under Murad I in the 1380s, and the name was accurate. They were new, not just newly created, but new in concept, a fundamentally different model of military force than anything that existed in the European or Islamic world of their time. To understand how different, you have to understand what armies looked like everywhere else in the 14th and 15th centuries. In feudal Europe, military forces were built primarily on obligation. A king called his nobles to war. The nobles brought their own retinues, knights and levies whose military service was owed as a condition of their land tenure. These forces were not standing armies. They assembled for a campaign and dispersed afterward. Their loyalty was to their lord, not to the state. Their training was inconsistent. Their equipment varied wildly. Their discipline in the field depended entirely on the character of their individual commander. In the Islamic world, the dominant military model was the ghulam system. Military slaves, not unlike the Devshirme concept, who formed the personal forces of rulers. This was more professional than the European feudal model, but it still tended to produce forces whose loyalty was personal and whose institutional continuity depended on the survival and authority of a specific master. The janissaries were something else. They were a permanent, professional, standing army, owned not by any individual lord or commander, but by the Ottoman state itself. They did not disperse between campaigns. They trained year-round. They lived in barracks in a deliberate structure of unit cohesion that modern military theorists would recognize immediately. They ate together, drilled together, slept together, and developed the kind of institutional identity and esprit de corps that feudal levies and personal retinues almost never achieved. Their spiritual and psychological identity was anchored in their relationship with the Bektashi Sufi order, a heterodox Islamic brotherhood whose mystical, ecumenical character was well suited to a force composed of men from Christian backgrounds who had converted to Islam as part of the Devshirme process. The Bektashi connection gave the janissaries a shared spiritual framework that was flexible enough to accommodate diverse origins while still binding the core together in a coherent collective identity. Their regimental soups, the shared meals of the janissary corps, became a symbol of unit cohesion so powerful that overturning the soup cauldrons became the traditional signal of janissary rebellion. But the most significant thing about the janissaries, the innovation that made them genuinely world-changing, was their relationship with technology. In the 14th and 15th centuries, gunpowder weapons were transforming the nature of warfare. Cannons and early firearms were appearing on European and Middle Eastern battlefields, but most armies treated them as supplementary tools, useful for sieges, dangerous but slow and unreliable in open battle. Most military establishments of the era were deeply conservative about adopting gunpowder weapons, in part because the armored cavalry class, knights in Europe, Sipahi in the Ottoman world, whose entire social identity and military value was built around mounted shot combat, had strong institutional incentives to resist technologies that made their skills obsolete. The janissaries had no such institutional conservatism. They were not cavalry. They had no aristocratic pride tied to the sword and the horse. They were infantry, professionals, and they evaluated military technology on a single criterion. Does it kill the enemy more effectively? By the early 1400s, the janissaries were among the first military forces in the world to systematically incorporate firearms, early arquebuses and hand cannons, into their tactical doctrine. They did not simply add guns to an existing formation. They developed genuinely integrated tactics that combined missile fire, close-order infantry discipline, and mobile artillery in ways that were decades ahead of anything comparable in Europe or the Middle East. This technological progressiveness was not accidental. It flowed directly from the institutional character of the Janissaries, professional, meritocratic, not burdened by the social conservatism of a hereditary military class. They could adopt new technology because no one in their institutional hierarchy had a social identity invested in the old technology. The culmination of Janissary military effectiveness, the moment that announced to the world exactly what the Ottomans had built, came on May 29th, 1453. The siege of Constantinople, the city that had resisted every attack for more than 1,000 years. The city that was the living symbol of Byzantine civilization, the capital of what its inhabitants still called the Roman Empire. The city that sat at the intersection of Europe and Asia, controlling the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and that represented, in the imagination of the entire Christian world, a sacred inheritance that could not be surrendered. Mehmed II, 21 years old, obsessive, ferociously intelligent, and driven by an ambition that bordered on mania, had been preparing for this siege for years. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to cast the largest cannon the world had ever seen. A gun so massive it required 60 oxen to move and could hurl a stone ball weighing several hundred kilograms. He assembled a fleet to cut off Byzantine resupply by sea. He built a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus in 4 months. A construction project of staggering logistical ambition. He studied the defensive architecture of the Theodosian walls, the triple fortification system that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years, and he developed specific tactical plans for each section. And at the heart of his assault force, trained, disciplined, armed with the most advanced gunpowder weapons available, and possessed of an institutional ferocity that came from decades of professional military culture, were the Janissaries. The siege lasted 53 days. The Theodosian walls, which had never been breached in more than 1,000 years of continuous defensive use, fell under the combination of Mehmed's massive artillery and the Janissary assault. On the morning of May 29th, 1453, Mehmed II rode into Constantinople through the gate of St. Romanus. He was, by his own reckoning, both the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and the inheritor of Roman imperial authority. He was not wrong. The Devshirme and the Janissaries were the most visible and dramatic elements of the Ottoman system. But the empire's administrative architecture, the less dramatic, less celebrated, but equally essential framework of governance, was just as important to its longevity. The Timur system was the economic and administrative glue that held the Ottoman provincial structure together. A Timur was a land grant, not an ownership grant, but a revenue grant. A military officer or administrator was assigned the tax revenues of a specific piece of territory in exchange for maintaining a specified number of cavalry soldiers and presenting them for imperial service when called. This was on the surface similar to European feudal land grants. But there was a crucial difference. Timur grants were not hereditary by default. They were held at the Sultan's pleasure and revoked upon the holder's death unless specifically renewed. Timur holders could not pass their grants to their sons automatically. They could not build independent power bases on their land. They were administrators, not lords. This distinction between administrative stewardship and hereditary ownership was the difference between a bureaucracy and a feudal aristocracy. And it was a distinction that the Ottomans enforced with remarkable consistency during the empire's high period. The result was a provincial administrative class that was capable and motivated because their income depended on effectively managing their territory, but structurally prevented from accumulating the kind of independent power that turned European feudal lords into threats to royal authority. Above the Timur holders sat the provincial governors, the Beylerbeys and Sanjak Beys, appointed by Istanbul, answerable to Istanbul, and rotated with sufficient regularity to prevent them from developing the kind of deep local roots that historically produced regional separatism. Above them sat the Grand Vizier, the chief minister of the empire, who operated through the institution known as the Sublime Porte, originally a reference to the physical gate of the Grand Vizier's offices in Istanbul, but over time a synonym for the Ottoman government itself. The legal framework that held all of this together was a deliberate and sophisticated dual system. Islamic Sharia law governed matters of personal status, inheritance, and religious practice for the empire's Muslim population. But alongside Sharia sat the canon, imperial law promulgated by the Sultan, addressing administrative, military, and fiscal matters that Sharia did not cover comprehensively. This was not a contradiction in Ottoman legal thinking. It was a recognition that a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire governing 3 continents required a legal framework more flexible than any single religious tradition could provide. The coexistence of Sharia and canon, and the extension of separate legal autonomy to non-Muslim communities through the Millet system, which Act 3 will examine in depth, allowed the empire to be simultaneously an Islamic state and a genuinely pluralist administrative entity. And threading through all of it was something that modern organizational theorists would recognize immediately: institutional memory. The Ottoman bureaucracy developed, over generations, a culture of documentation, precedent, and procedural continuity that allowed the empire to function consistently even through periods of weak or incompetent sultans. The system had been designed, from its earliest days, to be bigger than any individual. When Bayezid I was captured at Ankara, the system kept running. When a sultan died and his successor was a child, the Grand Vizier and the Porte kept governing. When a region experienced a local crisis, the administrative framework provided the tools for resolution without requiring direct intervention from Istanbul. This is what institutional resilience actually looks like in practice. Not invulnerability, not the absence of crises, but the capacity to absorb crises and continue functioning, to adapt, repair, and persist. When Mehmed II entered Constantinople on May 29, 1453, he did something that a purely militaristic conqueror would never have thought to do. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Christian world, the architectural and spiritual crown of Byzantine civilization, and he stood inside it in silence. Then he converted it into a mosque, and he gave explicit orders that the rest of the city was not to be destroyed. This was a message, a deliberate, carefully constructed message about what kind of empire he intended to rule. Mehmed II was not simply a Turkish sultan who had defeated a Christian city. He was, in his own self-presentation and in the logic of the administrative system he was building, the heir to Rome. He studied Greek and Latin. He corresponded with humanist scholars in Italy. He commissioned a portrait of himself from Gentile Bellini, the Venetian master. He called himself Kaiseri Rom, Caesar of Rome, and he meant it not as metaphor, but as political claim. He was inserting the Ottoman Empire into the legitimacy chain of the ancient world, not replacing Roman civilization, but absorbing it, the way the Ottoman system absorbed everything it conquered. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul, a name derived from the Greek phrase meaning in the city or to the city, was a physical embodiment of this absorptive logic. Mehmed repopulated the depleted city deliberately and systematically, bringing in Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Turks from across the empire to rebuild its commercial and intellectual life. He wanted a cosmopolitan capital, not a trophy. He understood that a great city is an economic engine, a center of intellectual production, and a symbol of imperial legitimacy, and that it needed people of diverse skills and backgrounds to function as any of those things. By the time of Mehmed's death in 1481, Istanbul had been transformed into one of the most diverse and dynamic cities on earth. It was simultaneously a Muslim capital, a center of Greek Orthodox Christianity. Mehmed guaranteed the Patriarch's authority over Orthodox Christians throughout the empire, a major hub of Jewish intellectual and commercial life, and a crossroads of trade connecting the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, and through them, the trade arteries of Asia and the Indian Ocean world. This was the template: military conquest followed by deliberate, systematic, institutionally supported integration. forced to establish authority. Pragmatism to make that authority sustainable. Diversity not as a problem to be managed, but as a resource to be harvested. The Ottoman Empire was not, by 1481, simply a military power that had conquered a lot of territory. It was a functioning administrative civilization, arguably the most sophisticated multi-ethnic governance system that had ever existed up to that point in human history. It had produced an elite formation system that broke the hereditary power concentration problem. It had built a military institution that was professional, technologically progressive, and institutionally loyal in a way that feudal armies never were. It had developed an administrative architecture that kept the empire functional even when individual leaders failed. And it had absorbed the most symbolically significant city in the Christian world and transformed it, within a generation, into the living proof of its own governing philosophy. All of this, every system, every institution, every administrative innovation, would reach its full expression in the century that followed. The century of Suleiman the Magnificent. The century when the Ottoman Empire was not just the most powerful state in the world, but arguably the most sophisticated one. The machinery had been built. Now it was time to see what it could do at full power. In the year 1520, a 26-year-old man inherited the most powerful empire on earth. He had been educated in the palace schools of Istanbul, the same Devshirme pipeline that produced grand viziers and janissary commanders applied now to the Sultan's own son. He had served as a provincial governor in 3 different postings before he was 20, learning the practical mechanics of Ottoman administration from the ground up. He spoke 6 languages. He wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibbi, the Beloved. He was a practicing goldsmith of genuine skill. He corresponded in fluent Arabic and Persian with the leading scholars and philosophers of the Islamic world. He maintained a correspondence with European monarchs that was at once diplomatically precise and personally thoughtful. His name was Suleiman, and what he built over the next 46 years of his reign was not simply an empire at the height of its military power. It was a civilization at the height of its organizational genius. Europeans called him Suleiman the Magnificent, a title that captured his imperial grandeur, his court culture, his architectural ambitions, and the sheer overwhelming scale of Ottoman power during his reign. It is a title that emphasizes spectacle. It is the title of a conqueror, a patron of arts, a sovereign whose court dazzled every foreign ambassador who entered it. The Ottomans called him something different. They called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. And that title, the one his own people gave him, is the one that actually explains why his reign was the apex of Ottoman civilization rather than simply its most dramatic military chapter. Because Suleiman, the lawgiver, understood something that Suleiman the Magnificent only illustrated. He understood that the durability of an empire is not determined by the size of its armies or the splendor of its capital. It is determined by the quality of its laws, by the coherence and fairness of the systems through which millions of diverse people experience authority in their daily lives, by whether the farmer in Bulgaria and the merchant in Cairo and the scholar in Baghdad and the fishermen on the Aegean coast all have reason to believe that the empire that governs them will treat them according to rules that are consistent, predictable, and broadly just. That was the project of Suleiman's reign. Not conquest, though there was plenty of conquest. Not architecture, though the skyline of Istanbul was permanently transformed by his chief architect, the incomparable Mimar Sinan. The central project was legal and administrative consolidation. The systematic harmonization of the Ottoman legal framework into a coherent, codified, and universally applicable system of governance that would hold the empire together from its European frontiers to the Persian Gulf. To understand what this meant, you have to understand what the Ottoman legal landscape looked like before Suleiman. It was, in a word, layered. Centuries of expansion across radically different territories had produced a patchwork of legal arrangements. Local customary laws in the Balkans, different customary laws in Anatolia, Mamluk legal traditions in Egypt, Arab tribal law in the Arabian Peninsula, Byzantine commercial law still functioning in the cities of Greece and the Aegean. Alongside all of this ran Islamic Sharia, authoritative for Muslim subjects on matters of personal status and religious life, but interpreted differently by different schools of jurisprudence in different regions. And running parallel to both was the growing body of imperial canon law, the Sultan's own legislation on administrative, military, and fiscal matters. This was not chaos. The Ottomans had been managing this complexity since the beginning, but it was unwieldy. It was inconsistent. An inconsistency in a large empire is the seed of resentment, because people who are governed inconsistently will eventually notice. And people who notice that others are treated by different rules than they will eventually ask why. And that question, when it spreads widely enough, becomes political instability. Suleiman, advised by his chief legal scholar Abbasud Effendi, one of the most brilliant legal minds in Ottoman history, undertook a systematic review and codification of the empire's legal framework. Together, they worked to harmonize the canon with Sharia, to standardize administrative procedures across provinces, to regularize taxation, to clarify land tenure rights, and to establish consistent legal procedures for resolving disputes across the empire's extraordinary diversity of communities. The result was not a single unified legal code in the modern sense. The Ottoman system was too complex and too deliberately pluralistic for that. But it was a harmonized framework, a set of principles and procedures that applied consistently across the empire's administrative machinery, even as it preserved the legal autonomy of different religious and ethnic communities in their internal affairs. This was governance of a sophistication that no contemporary European state could match. France in 1530 was a patchwork of regional legal systems so inconsistent that the same crime could carry different penalties in different provinces. England was still working out the relationship between common law, canon law, and royal prerogative. The Holy Roman Empire was, as Voltaire would famously remark 2 centuries later, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. A collection of hundreds of semi-autonomous entities with no coherent administrative framework at all. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman had a functioning, codified, empire-wide legal system administered by a trained professional judiciary, with a clear hierarchy of courts and a recognized body of precedent. For 15 to 20 million people spread across 3 continents, this was not a minor administrative achievement. It was a civilizational one. Suleiman himself was not a simple man. His reign contained cruelty alongside its brilliance. He had his closest friend, the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, executed after 13 years of intimate partnership, almost certainly at the instigation of his powerful wife Hurrem Sultan, in a moment that revealed the dangerous proximity of personal relationships to imperial politics. He had his own son Mustafa strangled on suspicion of treasonous ambition, a decision he may have spent the rest of his life regretting. He was a human being with all the contradictions that entails, but his capacity for governance, for systemic thinking, for understanding that an empire is ultimately a legal and administrative project rather than a military one. That capacity was genuine, and its effects lasted long after his death in 1566. Of all the Ottoman administrative innovations, none is more discussed, more debated, or more consequential than the Millet system, and none is more frequently misunderstood, either romanticized into a model of harmonious multicultural coexistence that never quite existed, or dismissed as a cynical mechanism of divide and rule that obscures the genuine sophistication beneath it. The truth, as is usually the case, is more interesting than either version. The word millet comes from the Arabic word for nation or community, specifically a religious community defined by shared faith rather than shared ethnicity or territory. The Millet system was the Ottoman framework for governing the empire's non-Muslim populations, and its core principle was deceptively simple. Each recognized religious community would be permitted to govern its own internal affairs according to its own laws and institutions, under the leadership of its own religious hierarchy, in exchange for loyalty to the Sultan and payment of the designated tax obligations. In practice, this meant the following. The Greek Orthodox Christian community which included not just ethnic Greeks, but Bulgarians, Serbians, and other Orthodox populations across the Balkans, was governed in its internal religious, educational, and legal affairs by the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Istanbul. The Patriarch was recognized by the Ottoman state as the civil as well as religious head of his community. He collected taxes from Orthodox subjects, maintained Orthodox courts for matters of personal status and inheritance, ran Orthodox schools and churches, and administered the community's charitable institutions. He was, in effect, a subordinate governor for a population defined by faith rather than territory. The same logic applied to the Armenian Christian community, governed by the Armenian Patriarch in Istanbul, and to the Jewish community, governed by the chief rabbi, a position that Mehmed II had formally established after the conquest of Constantinople, completing the Millet framework that subsequent sultans, and Suleiman in particular, formalized and extended. Now, consider what this system actually accomplished. In an era when the standard European approach to religious minorities was forced conversion, expulsion, or systematic persecution, the Ottoman Empire was offering recognized religious communities the right to exist, to govern themselves internally, to maintain their language and culture and educational institutions, and to practice their faith openly. The concrete illustration of what this meant in practice arrived in 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, an event that tends to dominate the historical memory of that year. In 1492, the Spanish crown issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews from Spain. After centuries of Jewish intellectual, commercial, and cultural life in Iberia, after generations during which Jewish scholars had served as translators, physicians, financiers, and philosophers in the courts of both Christian and Muslim rulers, the Sephardic Jewish community was given 4 months to convert or leave. Roughly 200,000 people were expelled. Sultan Bayezid II sent the Ottoman navy to bring them to Ottoman territory. His reported response to the expulsion, that Ferdinand of Spain had impoverished his own kingdom by expelling people who enriched it, was characteristically Ottoman in its pragmatism. He was not making a statement about religious tolerance as a moral principle. He was making an observation about administrative intelligence. Skilled people are an asset. Expelling skilled people because of their religion is self-defeating. The Ottoman system was built on the opposite logic. Attract the capable, regardless of origin, and give them a reason to be useful to you. The Sephardic Jews who settled in Istanbul, Thessaloniki, Izmir, and other Ottoman cities brought with them something that the Ottoman Empire needed enormously. They brought printing technology, medical knowledge, commercial networks spanning the entire Mediterranean, and intellectual traditions that have been refined over centuries of engagement with both Islamic and Christian scholarship. Thessaloniki, in particular, became one of the most dynamic Jewish cities in the world, a center of commerce, printing, and Kabbalistic scholarship that would remain distinctively Jewish in character for more than 400 years. The economic dividend of this absorption was enormous. The intellectual dividend was equally significant, and the signal it sent to every religious minority across the Ottoman world was unmistakable. If you are useful and you accept Ottoman authority, you will be protected. This signal had a stabilizing effect that is difficult to quantify, but impossible to overstate. In a multi-religious empire, the greatest source of internal instability is the fear of minority communities that the majority will eventually turn against them. That fear produces political disloyalty, the calculation that aligning with an external power who might offer protection is more prudent than trusting a state that might someday persecute you. The Millet system, by providing institutional guarantees of community autonomy, substantially reduced that fear. It gave minority communities a stake in the empire's stability. Their institutions, their churches, their synagogues, their schools, their courts existed within the Ottoman framework. The empire's survival was their survival. This was pragmatic tolerance, not the principled pluralism of modern liberal democracies, but a governing technology that produced many of the same stabilizing effects. It worked because it served the interests of both the empire and the communities it governed. The empire got a diverse, relatively stable, economically productive population. The communities got protection, autonomy, and a framework within which their cultures could survive and develop. The limitations must also be named clearly. The Millet system was not equality. Non-Muslim subjects paid the jizya, a poll tax that was simultaneously a marker of subordinate status and a formal mechanism for purchasing protection. Non-Muslims could not serve in the military, which was both a burden and, from certain perspectives, a privilege exempted from the empire's most dangerous obligations. They could not build new religious structures without permission, and that permission was not always granted. They could not proselytize to Muslims. Their legal testimony carried less weight than that of Muslim witnesses in certain court proceedings. These were real restrictions with real consequences in daily life. The dhimmi status, the protected but subordinate status of non-Muslim subjects, was not equality. Anyone who claims otherwise is projecting modern values onto a pre-modern system in ways that distort rather than illuminate. But comparison is the appropriate tool of historical analysis, not modern idealism. Compared to the contemporaneous alternatives, the Inquisition in Spain, the massacre of Huguenots in France, the systematic persecution of religious minorities across virtually every European state of the same era, the Ottoman Millet system was, for its time and place, a genuinely sophisticated and relatively humane approach to governing religious diversity. It kept the peace across an empire of extraordinary complexity for centuries. And in doing so, it preserved cultures, languages, and intellectual traditions that would otherwise have been extinguished. Stability and law and multicultural administration are abstractions until they translate into material reality. And in the Ottoman Empire at its peak, the material reality was extraordinary. Istanbul in the mid-1500s was the largest city in Europe, with a population estimated at between 400,000 and 700,000 people. To put that in perspective, London at the same time had roughly 80,000 inhabitants. Paris had perhaps 200,000. Istanbul was in a different category entirely. A genuine world metropolis, the center of a commercial network that connected the Black Sea grain trade, the Silk Road luxury goods trade, the spice routes of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the manufacturing economies of the Balkans and Anatolia. The Ottoman economy at its peak was built on three structural advantages that no contemporary European state could replicate. The first was geography. The empire sat astride every major land trade, route connecting Europe to Asia. The Silk Road passed through Ottoman territory. The spice trade from the Indian Ocean world flowed into the Mediterranean through Ottoman control ports. Goods moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass through the Bosphorus, which the Ottomans controlled absolutely after 1453. Every caravan, every merchant vessel, every cargo of silk or spice or grain that moved between the continents was, in some form, subject to Ottoman commercial regulation and, therefore, Ottoman taxation. The second structural advantage was the diversity of its productive base. The Ottoman Empire was not dependent on a single commodity or a single region for its economic vitality. The Balkans provided grain, timber, and mineral resources. Anatolia provided wool, cotton, and agricultural surplus. Egypt, conquered by Selim I in 1517, provided sugar, linen, and the enormous economic engine of the Nile Delta. The Levantine coast provided the entrepot trade connecting the Mediterranean to the overland routes of the Middle East and Persia. This diversification meant that no single economic shock, a bad harvest, a disrupted trade route, a plague in one region, could collapse the whole. The third advantage was the role of minority merchant communities operating within the Millet framework. Greek, Armenian, and Jewish merchants functioned as the connective tissue of the Ottoman commercial system. Their community networks, which stretched across the empire and far beyond its borders, into Venice, into Persia, into the Indian Ocean trading world, gave Ottoman commerce a reach and a flexibility that purely Ottoman institutions could not have provided alone. The empire created the conditions for these networks to function and then harvested a portion of their productivity through taxation and commercial regulation. It was in its own pre-modern way a remarkably sophisticated model of public-private economic partnership. The Istanbul Bazaar, the Grand Bazaar, the Kapalı Çarşı was not merely a market. It was the physical embodiment of this economic system, with thousands of shops organized by trade and connected through a covered labyrinth of streets that reflected centuries of commercial evolution. It was the most complex commercial infrastructure in the pre-modern world. Goods from China and India sat alongside goods from France and Venice. Merchants conducting business in a dozen languages were simultaneously conducting business under a single, coherent Ottoman commercial legal framework. This was what the combination of legal codification, administrative stability, and multicultural integration produced in material terms. Not just military power, not just architectural grandeur, but an economy of genuine complexity and resilience, generating the tax revenues that funded the janissaries, the palace schools, the legal system, and every other institutional pillar of Ottoman power. None of what Suleiman built in law, administration, and economy should obscure the fact that his empire was also, simultaneously, the most formidable military power on earth. And understanding the military dimensions of the Golden Age is essential to understanding both the peak and the pressures that followed. In 1529, Suleiman's army appeared before the walls of Vienna. The Habsburgs, the ruling dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire, the most powerful Christian political entity in Europe, trembled. If Vienna had fallen, the Ottoman frontier would have moved to the heart of Western Europe. It did not fall, primarily because supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain had exhausted the Ottoman logistics capacity before the siege could be completed, and the approach of autumn forced Suleiman to withdraw. But the message that had been sent was unmistakable. The Ottoman Empire could project military force to the gates of Western Europe, and no single European power had the capacity to stop it. The fear generated by the siege of Vienna reshaped European politics for a generation. It accelerated the formation of diplomatic alliances, contributed to the urgency of European military modernization, and, in one of the most striking geopolitical paradoxes of the era, drove the Christian king of France, Francis I, to seek an alliance with the Ottoman Sultan against their mutual enemy, the Habsburgs. The Franco-Ottoman alliance, formalized through a series of capitulation agreements beginning in 1536, was the most counterintuitive diplomatic arrangement of the 16th century. The most Christian king of France, in open alliance with the Islamic Ottoman Empire, coordinating military pressure against fellow Christian Habsburgs. European contemporaries were scandalized. Francis was denounced from pulpits across Europe. None of it changed the strategic logic. France needed the Ottomans as a counterweight to Habsburg encirclement. The Ottomans found in France a useful lever for keeping European pressure off their western flank. Pragmatism triumphed over ideology, as it so often did in Ottoman statecraft. On the Mediterranean, Ottoman naval power reached its own peak under one of the most remarkable figures of the era, Harun Barbarossa. Born on the Greek island of Lesbos, of mixed Greek and Turkish parentage, Barbarossa had risen through the world of North African corsair warfare to become the Ottoman Grand Admiral, the Kapıdan Pasha, appointed by Suleiman in 1533. Under his command, the Ottoman fleet transformed from a capable coastal force into the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean. He raided the coasts of Spain and Italy, captured Tunis, outmaneuvered the combined fleets of the Holy League, and by the time of his death in 1546 had established Ottoman naval supremacy in the sea that had once been a Roman lake and was now, definitively, an Ottoman one. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, 5 years after Suleiman's death, is frequently cited as the moment the Ottoman naval myth was shattered. A combined Christian fleet under Don John of Austria defeated the Ottoman fleet decisively, killing or capturing tens of thousands of Ottoman sailors and oarsmen in the largest naval battle of the 16th century. And then the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet, within 2 years, at a scale that astonished their enemies. When the Venetian diplomat Giacomo Soranzo informed the Doge that the Ottomans had reconstructed their entire naval capacity in under 2 years, he described a state whose institutional and economic resources were so deep that a defeat that would have permanently crippled any European naval power was, for the Ottomans, an expensive inconvenience. They had lost a battle. They had not lost the capacity to wage war. This was the golden age in its military dimension. Not invincibility, but resilience. Not the absence of defeat, but the ability to absorb defeat and return, because the empire's institutional foundations were strong enough to sustain the losses that any large military power will inevitably sustain. To the east, the Ottoman Empire faced its most persistent strategic challenge in the form of the Safavid Persian Empire, a Shia Muslim power whose very existence was a theological and political provocation to the Sunni Ottoman state. The Ottoman-Safavid conflict was the great eastern drain on imperial resources throughout the 16th century and beyond, a recurring war that could be won in battle but never resolved definitively, because the Safavids were too deeply rooted in their own territory to be conquered and too ideologically committed to their Shia identity to be absorbed. Suleiman fought the Safavids 3 times. He captured Tabriz twice and Baghdad once, but he could never make those gains permanent. The Safavid conflict was the eastern wall against which Ottoman military power repeatedly exhausted itself. A reminder that even the most powerful empire has limits, and that the geography and ideology of determined resistance can outlast the most formidable military force. The two-front strategic reality, the Habsburgs and their allies to the west, the Safavids to the east, was a structural constraint that Suleiman managed with extraordinary skill but could never eliminate. His reign was, in military terms, a sustained exercise in managing the constraint while still projecting power in every direction simultaneously. That he succeeded as comprehensively as he did for 46 years is a testament to both his own capacity and the institutional strength of the machinery he had inherited and refined. When Suleiman died in September of 1566, on campaign in Hungary, in his tent at the age of 71, having never stopped leading his empire from the front, he left behind a state at the absolute apex of its power. Its treasury was full. Its legal system was the most codified and comprehensive in the world. Its military was feared from Vienna to the Persian Gulf. Its capital was the most cosmopolitan city on earth. Its minority communities were, by the standards of the era, more protected and more institutionally recognized than anywhere else in the world. He also left behind a set of structural pressures that his successors would struggle to manage. The Janissaries were growing politically assertive. The Timur system was showing signs of administrative strain. The global economy was beginning the slow shift westward that the Portuguese had initiated by rounding Africa 70 years earlier. And the hereditary principle, the very thing the Devshirme had been designed to suppress, was reasserting itself in new and dangerous forms. The Golden Age was real. Its achievements were genuine, remarkable, and in several cases historically unprecedented. But it was not a plateau. It was a peak. And from peaks, there's only one direction. The question, the genuinely fascinating historical question, is not why the Ottoman Empire eventually declined. Everything declines. The question is how it survived for another 3.5 centuries after Suleiman's death. How an empire that had supposedly begun its decline in 1566 was still governing territory, still projecting power, still functioning as a major actor in world politics in 1900. That is not a story of decline. That is a story of survival. And it is, in its own way, just as impressive as anything that came before it. In 1683, an Ottoman army of roughly 140,000 soldiers marched to the walls of Vienna for the second time in history. This was 117 years after the death of Suleiman the Magnificent. 117 years into what European historians and later Ottoman historians influenced by European frameworks would call the era of Ottoman decline. An era of supposedly weakening sultans, corroding institutions, military obsolescence, and slow imperial decay. And yet, there they were, at Vienna, again, with the largest army that had appeared on European soil in a generation, capable of projecting force from their capital in Istanbul to the heart of Central Europe, across thousands of miles of difficult terrain, in a logistical operation of staggering complexity. Still, after more than a century of supposed decline, the single most powerful military force in the European theater. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 ultimately failed. A combined relief force of Polish, Habsburg, and German troops under the Polish King Jan Sobieski broke the Ottoman lines in one of the most consequential battles of the 17th century. The Ottomans retreated, and the retreat from Vienna in 1683 is conventionally treated as the definitive turning point, the moment the tide irrevocably turned against the empire. But here is what that narrative obscures. An empire that is genuinely in terminal decline does not project 140,000 soldiers to the gates of Vienna 117 years after its supposed peak. An empire in terminal decline does not remain the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa for another 2 centuries after its supposed turning point. An empire in terminal decline does not continue to be a central actor in European great power diplomacy well into the 1800s. The decline narrative of the Ottoman Empire, the story of a once great power slowly rotting from within, inexorably weakening from the moment Suleiman closed his eyes in 1566, is not simply wrong. It is a story that was constructed deliberately and ideologically by people with strong interests in telling it. European powers needed the narrative of Ottoman decline to justify their own expanding ambitions in Ottoman-adjacent territories. Later nationalist historians, both European nationalists celebrating the liberation of Balkan peoples from Ottoman rule, and Turkish nationalist historians constructing a founding mythology for the Republic of Turkey, needed a story of late Ottoman dysfunction to give their own political projects legitimacy. Even some Ottoman reformers of the 19th century embraced the decline narrative, because diagnosing the empire as critically ill gave them political justification for radical reform agendas. The result was a historiographical consensus built more on political need than historical accuracy. And modern Ottoman scholarship, led by historians like Halil Analsik, Semil Kafadar, and Soraya Faroki, has spent the last 5 decades systematically dismantling it. What the post-Suleiman era actually looks like, when examined without the distorting lens of the decline narrative, is not a story of simple decay. It is a story of an extraordinarily complex institution navigating a set of structural challenges, some self-generated, some externally imposed, with a combination of reform, adaptation, diplomatic creativity, and institutional resilience that extended the empire's functional life by centuries beyond what any comparable institution achieved. The Ottoman Empire after 1566 was not the Ottoman Empire of Suleiman. It was different. It faced different challenges, operated in a different global environment, and responded with different strategies. Some of those responses were brilliant. Some were inadequate. Most were both simultaneously, in a way that large institutions responding to complex challenges usually are. But calling it decline, as if the 3.5 centuries between Suleiman's death and the empire's end were simply a long, slow falling, that is not history. That is a morality tale imposed on a reality that was far more interesting. The reality was adaptation. Painful, contested, sometimes catastrophically mismanaged adaptation. But adaptation nonetheless. And the first, most urgent, most dangerous adaptation the empire had to manage was the problem it had, in a sense, created itself. The problem of the Janissaries. There is a pattern in the history of powerful institutions that appears so consistently across so many different cultures and time periods that it almost deserves to be called a law of organizational physics. The mechanism that an institution creates to solve its most dangerous structural problem will, over time, become that institution's most dangerous structural problem. The Janissaries were created to solve the hereditary loyalty problem, to produce a military and administrative elite that was loyal to the state rather than to family, tribe, or independent power base. For roughly 2 centuries, they performed this function with extraordinary effectiveness. They were the empire's most powerful military asset, its most loyal institutional arm, and a living demonstration of what meritocratic elite formation could produce. And then, gradually, inexorably, they became something else entirely. The transformation began with a seemingly minor policy adjustment. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, janissaries began to be permitted to marry. Then they began to be permitted to enroll their sons in the corps. Then the Devshirme recruitment of Christian boys began to slow, partly because the supply of suitable recruit from the Balkans was becoming harder to manage as those territories became more settled and politically complex, and partly because the existing janissary families had strong institutional incentives to limit the intake of outside recruits who would compete with their own sons for advancement. By the mid-1500s, the janissary corps had begun the transition from a meritocratic institution of converted slaves to a hereditary military caste. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, it had essentially completed that transition. The sons of janissaries became janissaries. The grandsons of janissaries became janissaries. The corps that had been designed specifically to prevent the formation of hereditary military elites had become precisely that. The consequences were institutional, military, and political, and they compounded each other in a cycle that became increasingly difficult to interrupt. Institutionally, the shift to hereditary membership corroded the meritocratic culture that had made the janissaries effective. When advancement depends on demonstrated ability, the institution optimizes for ability. When advancement depends on family connection and seniority, the institution optimizes for survival and comfort. The janissaries of the 17th century were not the janissaries of the 15th. They were not less brave or less tough as individuals, but they were institutionally conservative in ways that their predecessors had never been. They resisted new military technologies and tactics, particularly the military innovations of the European armies that were rapidly transforming their own forces in the crucible of the 30 Years' War. They resisted organizational reforms that would have diluted their privileges. They resisted change systematically and effectively because change threatened the institutional arrangements that sustained their hereditary advantages. Militarily, this conservatism had devastating consequences on the battlefield. The European military revolution of the 17th century, the development of linear tactics, improved firearms, professional officer corps, and coordinated combined arms operations that would eventually produce the armies of Marlborough and Eugene of Savoy, left the increasingly rigid janissary model behind. Ottoman armies that had once been technologically and tactically ahead of their European counterparts were now falling behind, and the institutional structure of the janissary corps made catching up extraordinarily difficult. Politically, the situation was even more dangerous. The janissaries' physical presence in Istanbul, their barracks were in the heart of the capital, gave them a leverage over sultans and governments that no military institution should ever have over the state it serves. They had deposed sultans before. They knew they had deposed sultans before. Every sultan after the mid-1500s governed with the knowledge that an unpopular decision, an insufficiently funded campaign, or a perceived threat to janissary privileges could result in the overturning of the soup cauldrons, the signal of janissary revolt, and the very real possibility of assassination or deposition. Between 1617 and 1623 alone, the janissaries deposed 3 sultans. In the course of the 17th century, they executed or deposed enough sultans and grand viziers to make the position of Ottoman chief executive genuinely life-threatening in a way that had nothing to do with external enemies. The Ottomans were not unaware of this problem. It was visible, urgent, and discussed by every serious reformer in the empire from the mid-1500s onward. A genre of Ottoman political literature, the Nasihat name, or advice literature, emerged specifically to diagnose and propose solutions for the institutional decay of the janissary corps and the broader administrative machinery. Reformist sultans and grand viziers attempted repeatedly to restructure the core, reduce its political influence, and introduce new military formations alongside it. Almost every attempt failed, because the Janissaries had the institutional power to resist reform, and because the political cost of forcing reform through was, for most sultans, too high to risk. It took until 1826, more than 2 centuries after the Janissary problem became acute, for an Ottoman sultan to finally solve it. Mahmud II. In an event the Ottomans officially named the auspicious incident, provoked the Janissaries into revolt and then crushed them. He had secretly built a new military force capable of defeating the Janissaries in direct combat, positioned artillery around their barracks in Istanbul, and when the soup cauldrons were overturned in the traditional signal of rebellion, he was ready. The Janissary corps was destroyed in a single day. Its surviving members were executed, exiled, or dispersed. Its barracks were demolished. Its institutional existence was erased. It was simultaneously a moment of genuine administrative courage and a reminder of how long institutional pathologies can persist before they are resolved. The Janissary problem had been visible for 250 years before Mahmud II solved it. The 250-year delay had cost the empire enormously in military effectiveness, in political stability, and in the reforms that could not be undertaken because the Janissaries would not permit them. But the fact that it was eventually solved, that the Ottoman system was still capable in 1826 of recognizing a structural problem and engineering a solution, is itself significant. It is what survival looks like when it is hard. While the Janissary problem was consuming the empire's internal political energy, a transformation was underway in the global economy that would prove, in the very long run, even more consequential. On July 8, 1497, a Portuguese fleet of 4 ships under the command of Vasco da Gama left Lisbon harbor. On May 20th, 1498, after sailing around the southern tip of Africa and across the Indian Ocean, da Gama arrived at Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential voyages in human history. Not because it was the first time Europeans had reached India. The overland routes had connected Europe to South Asia for millennia, but because it demonstrated for the first time that a sea route connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean was navigable, that spices, silks, cotton, and luxury goods could be transported from Asia to Europe by sea, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled land routes of the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean entirely. The Ottoman Empire's geographical position, the asset that had underpinned its economic dominance for 2 centuries, was not eliminated by da Gama's voyage. The land routes did not immediately cease to function. Merchants did not overnight abandon the caravan routes through Anatolia and the Levant. The transition from overland to maritime trade was gradual, measured in decades rather than years. But gradual is not the same as painless, and the directional pressure was unmistakable from the beginning. The Ottomans understood the threat. They were not passive observers of a development that was destroying their economic foundations. They responded with a strategic ambition that matched the scale of the challenge, an attempt to control the Indian Ocean trade routes that the Portuguese were opening by projecting Ottoman naval power into the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf and, through them, into the wider Indian Ocean world. In 1538, an Ottoman fleet sailed from Suez into the Indian Ocean and besieged the Portuguese-held port of Geo on the northwestern coast of India. The siege failed. The Ottomans tried again, repeatedly, over the following decades. They established a significant naval presence in the Red Sea, denied the Portuguese free access to the Arabian Peninsula, and maintained enough control of the Gulf of Aden to keep a meaningful portion of the spice trade flowing through Ottoman territory. But they could not win the Indian Ocean. The distances were too vast, the logistical demands too extreme, and the Portuguese, and later the Dutch and English, too committed to their maritime investment for the Ottomans to dislodge them. By the early 1600s, it was clear that the center of gravity of global trade was shifting westward and southward in ways that Ottoman power could slow but not reverse. This shift interacted with a second economic shock that hit the empire and the entire Eurasian world with devastating force in the late 1500s. The massive influx of silver from the Spanish colonies in the Americas, from the mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, flooded the global monetary system with a commodity that had previously been scarce. Silver was money in the pre-modern world. When it became abundant, its value fell. Prices rose. Currencies that were denominated in silver lost purchasing power. Wages and fixed tax revenues, expressed in silver, were worth less and less each year. This was the great inflation of the 16th and early 17th centuries, and it hit the Ottoman Empire with particular force because the empire's fiscal system was built on fixed tax assessments expressed in silver currency. The Timar holders who funded the provincial cavalry were paid in tax revenues that did not automatically adjust for inflation. The janissaries demanded pay increases to compensate for the falling purchasing power of their salaries, and they had the political muscle to make those demands stick, which meant the treasury was under constant upward pressure on military expenditure at precisely the moment that tax revenues were losing real value. The fiscal crisis that resulted was genuine and serious. It disrupted the Timar system, contributed to the political instability of the early 1600s, and forced repeated debasement of the Ottoman currency that further eroded economic confidence. And yet, the empire survived it. Not without damage, not without significant institutional stress, but it survived. The Ottoman state adjusted its tax assessment systems. It developed new fiscal instruments. It sold tax collection rights, the iltizam system of tax farming, to generate upfront revenue at the cost of long-term efficiency. It debased and recoined its currency. None of these measures were ideal. All of them carried costs that accumulated over time, but they kept the fiscal machinery functioning at a level that sustained the empire's basic operational capacity. By the mid-1600s, a set of grand viziers from the Copperle family had imposed a period of fiscal and military discipline on the empire that halted the worst of the institutional decay and rebuilt enough military capacity to project that 140,000-man army to Vienna in 1683. The Copperle era is sometimes called the Ottoman Recovery, and while that term overstates the completeness of the turnaround, it captures something real. The empire's institutional resilience, its capacity to produce capable administrators even in periods of structural stress, had not been exhausted. The Ottoman response to the global trade shift was ultimately insufficient to restore the economic primacy the empire had enjoyed in Suleiman's era. But it was sophisticated enough, adaptive enough, and sustained enough to extend the empire's economic viability for another 2 centuries. A period during which most of the empire's contemporaries also struggled with the same inflationary shock and came up with solutions that were no better and often worse. If the Ottoman economy in the post-Suleiman era was characterized by adaptation under pressure, Ottoman diplomacy in the same period was characterized by something closer to mastery. The Ottomans had been playing European powers against each other since the Franco-Ottoman alliance of the 1530s. What developed in the 17th and 18th centuries was a more sophisticated version of the same basic strategy, using the structural rivalries and balance of power dynamics of the European state system as a permanent buffer against coordinated European pressure on the empire. The logic was elegant. European powers, France, Britain, Austria, Russia, Venice, the Netherlands, were, throughout this period, almost continuously at war with each other or engage in intense political competition with each other. Their rivalries were dynastic, commercial, religious, and territorial, and they were deep enough that no European power was willing to allow any other European power to gain decisive advantage, even at the cost of tolerating or actively supporting the Ottoman Empire. France is the clearest example. The Franco-Ottoman relationship, which had begun with Francis I's scandal-generating alliance with Suleiman, continued in various forms for more than 3 centuries. France needed the Ottomans as a counterweight to Habsburg power. Later, France needed the Ottomans as a commercial partner and as a source of influence in the Levant. French merchants received preferential trading rights in Ottoman ports through the capitulation agreements. French diplomats in Istanbul had access and influence that no other European representative could match. And in return, French diplomatic support at critical moments provided the Ottoman Empire with a degree of cover in European politics that its declining military power alone could not have purchased. Britain developed a similar relationship in the 18th and 19th centuries. British strategic priority was preventing Russian expansion into the eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, expansion that would threaten the sea routes to India. The Ottoman Empire was the natural barrier to Russian southward expansion. British policy therefore supported Ottoman territorial integrity, not out of any particular sympathy for the Ottoman state, but because a functioning Ottoman Empire served British imperial interests better than the chaotic power vacuum its collapse would create. This was the capitulation's dynamic at its most sophisticated. The Ottoman state granted European powers, France, Britain, the Netherlands, and later others, preferential commercial access, legal extraterritoriality for their merchants, and various diplomatic privileges. On the surface, these capitulations look like concessions, like evidence of Ottoman weakness. And in their later form, as the 19th century progressed and the empire's leverage diminished, they did become instruments of European economic penetration that undermined Ottoman fiscal sovereignty. But in their origins, and for much of their history, the capitulations were not concessions extracted by strength. They were calculated trade-offs made by a state with a sophisticated understanding of what it needed from the European system. What the Ottomans needed was commercial revenue, diplomatic cover, and the prevention of unified European action against them. The capitulations bought all three. The cost, preferential terms for European merchants, was real but manageable as long as Ottoman domestic markets remained sufficiently deep and the empire maintained enough political leverage to calibrate the terms. The Ottomans also proved consistently capable of exploiting European religious and political divisions in ways that their enemies found infuriating and their diplomats found elegant. Protestant powers in Northern Europe, the Dutch, the English, the Protestant German states, had a structural incentive to welcome Ottoman pressure on Catholic Habsburg Austria, because every Ottoman campaign in Hungary was a campaign that diverted Habsburg military resources away from the Protestant Catholic conflict in Western Europe. The Ottomans exploited this alignment with conscious deliberateness, timing military pressure on the Habsburgs to coincide with moments of maximum European distraction. The Tanzimat reforms of the 1839 to 1876 era represent the most sophisticated and most debated version of the Ottoman diplomatic strategy. The Tanzimat, the word means reorganization, was a sweeping program of modernization and legal reform that touched virtually every dimension of Ottoman governance. The 1839 Hadi Sharif of Gulhane proclaimed the equality of all Ottoman subjects before the law regardless of religion. The 1856 Hadi Humayun extended and deepened these guarantees in the aftermath of the Crimean War. New commercial codes were drafted on the French model. New secular courts were established alongside the religious court system. A new constitution was promulgated in 1876. Historians have argued ever since about whether the Tanzimat was a genuine transformation of the Ottoman state or a strategic performance for European audiences, a theatrical demonstration of modern values designed to keep European powers from treating the Ottoman Empire as a legitimate target for partition. The honest answer is that it was both simultaneously, and that the tension between these two dimensions ran through every aspect of the reform program. Some Tanzimat reformers were genuine modernizers who believed that transforming the empire's legal and social framework was the only path to long-term survival. Others were primarily diplomatic tacticians who understood that in the post-Napoleonic European order, a state that could credibly claim to be reforming itself along liberal European lines was harder for European public opinion to support dismembering. Most were some combination of both. What the Tanzimat achieved, in diplomatic terms, was to make the Ottoman question genuinely complicated for European powers that might otherwise have been content to carve up its territory. If the Ottoman Empire was reforming, if it was guaranteeing legal equality to its Christian minorities, adopting European legal codes, and moving toward constitutional governance. Then the humanitarian justifications for European intervention became harder to sustain. And harder to sustain meant more politically costly. And more politically costly meant that the European powers who were tempted to partition Ottoman territory had to weigh those costs against the strategic benefits. It was not a permanent solution. No diplomatic strategy can substitute indefinitely for structural power. But it bought the empire time, decades of time, during which the reforms themselves produced real institutional changes, educated a new generation of Ottoman administrators and military officers, and built the organizational foundations that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would eventually use to construct the Turkish Republic from the Ottoman wreckage. The art of survival is not heroic. It does not make for stirring narratives of triumph. It is the unglamorous work of managing contradictions, buying time, adapting imperfectly to circumstances you cannot fully control, and keeping the institution alive long enough for circumstances to change in your favor. The Ottomans practiced this art for 3.5 centuries after Suleiman's death, across a succession of sultans of wildly varying capability, in the face of structural economic pressures that were slowly but irreversibly reshaping the world, against European powers whose military and industrial capacity was compounding at a rate the empire could not match. And they kept the empire alive. Diminished, yes. Territorially contracted, certainly. Institutionally stressed and internally contested, without question. But alive. Functioning. Governing. Still present at the table of world politics in a way that no other pre-modern empire managed for anywhere close to the same duration. The machine was slowing. The structural stresses were accumulating. The adaptations were becoming more costly and less effective. The European powers were growing stronger faster than the empire could reform itself. And the idea that would prove most lethal of all, not a foreign army, not an economic shock, not a failed military campaign, but an idea, was already spreading through the empire's diverse populations with a speed and a force that no administrative system, however sophisticated, had ever successfully contained. That idea was nationalism. And when nationalism arrived in the Ottoman world, arriving with the full ideological force of the French Revolution, the full romantic energy of the European nationalist movements of the 19th century, arriving in a multi-ethnic empire where the Millet system had kept communities intact and distinct for centuries. It found the most combustible material imaginable. The Millet system had preserved Greek identity, Bulgarian identity, Serbian identity, Armenian identity, Arab identity, had kept them alive and institutionally coherent across centuries of Ottoman rule. That preservation had been the system's genius. It was now, in the age of nationalism, its vulnerability. Because nationalism did not want preservation within an empire. Nationalism wanted independence from one. The 600 years were not over. But the clock, for the first time, was genuinely running out. There is a particular kind of ending that is worse than sudden collapse. It is the ending that takes a century. The ending where the institution is still standing, still functioning, still governing millions of people and projecting authority across vast territories, but where everyone, including the people inside it, can feel the structural weight shifting, can sense the direction of travel, can see clearly enough what is coming to be afraid of it, and cannot find the lever that would change it. That was the Ottoman Empire from roughly 1800 to 1914. Not dead, not even close to dead by most conventional measures, but carrying a weight of accumulated structural stress, economic, military, political, demographic, that was compounding faster than any combination of reform and diplomacy could relieve. The phrase that came to define this era was coined, according to the most widely cited account, by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in a conversation with the British ambassador in 1853. He called the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. The phrase was vivid, memorable, and politically useful, particularly for Russia, which had been pushing southward against Ottoman territory for more than a century and had strong strategic incentives to frame the empire as a terminal patient whose estate needed to be divided before it fell into the wrong hands. The phrase was also, as all effective propaganda, is built on a foundation of genuine truth. The Ottoman Empire in the mid-1800s was in real trouble. Its territory was contracting. Its finances were increasingly dependent on European creditors. Its military, despite the reforms of Mahmud II and his successors, was consistently outmatched by European armies that were industrializing their military capacity at a pace the empire could not keep up with. And the nationalist movements that had been building for decades were now producing irreversible facts on the ground. Greece had fought its War of Independence and won it between 1821 and 1829, the first successful nationalist secession from the Ottoman Empire, backed by the romantic enthusiasm of European public opinion and the military intervention of Britain, France, and Russia. The Greek case established a template. If a minority community within the Ottoman Empire could frame its struggle in the language of European nationalism and attract European great power support, it could win independence in ways that Ottoman military force alone could not prevent. Serbia gained effective autonomy. Romania emerged as an independent principality. Bulgaria, after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 and the Treaty of Berlin that followed, gained autonomy and then independence. Each secession took territory, tax base, and population from an empire that could afford to lose none of them. Each success inspired the next movement. Each European diplomatic intervention reminded the Ottomans that their territorial integrity was now subject to the judgment of powers that had their own interests in the empire's weakness. The financial dimension of this era deserves particular attention because it illustrates, more clearly than almost anything else, the structural trap in which the empire found itself. To fund the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, a war fought, ironically, in defense of Ottoman territory against Russian aggression, with British and French support, the Ottoman state took its first major foreign loan from European banks. It was not the last. By 1875, the empire had accumulated a foreign debt so large that it could not service the interest payments, and it was forced to declare partial bankruptcy. In 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established, a commission controlled by European creditors that took direct control of several major Ottoman revenue streams, including customs duties, salt and tobacco taxes, and stamp duties, in order to service the debt. This was not sovereignty in any meaningful sense. This was a state that had mortgaged significant portions of its fiscal independence to foreign creditors. Creditors who were also citizens of foreign powers with their own territorial ambitions in Ottoman lands. The capitulations that had once been diplomatic tools wielded by Ottoman statesmen had become structural mechanisms of European economic penetration. The trade-off that had made sense in the 16th century had compounded over time into a dependency that was increasingly difficult to escape. Internally, the empire was consuming itself in an ideological conflict that was, in its own way, as dangerous as any external pressure. The late 19th century Ottoman intelligentsia was divided among three fundamentally incompatible visions of what the empire should become. The Ottomanists argued for a renewed civic identity that would transcend ethnic and religious division, an Ottoman citizenship that Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Turks, and Bulgarians could all inhabit on equal terms. The Islamists argued that the empire's cohesion should be anchored in its Islamic identity, the Sultan as caliph, the Islamic community as the empire's core constituency, and the Turkish nationalists, an emerging faction who would eventually dominate the empire's final decades, argued that the Turkish ethnic identity was the empire's irreducible core and that the multi-ethnic experiment had failed. Each of these visions had something to recommend it. Each of them was also, by the late 19th century, probably too late to save the empire on its own terms. The Ottomanist dream of a civic identity capable of superseding ethnic nationalism was being destroyed by the very forces of European nationalism that were simultaneously dismembering Ottoman territory. The Islamist vision had difficulty accommodating the empire's Christian and Jewish populations, whose loyalty it needed. The Turkish nationalist vision required the empire to abandon the multicultural identity that had been its governing logic for 600 years. which was not a reform, but a self-negation. The Young Turk movement, formerly the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, emerged from this ideological ferment as the dominant political force of the empire's final decade. They were, in their origins, genuine modernizers. Young, educated, mostly military officers who had trained in European schools and absorbed European ideas about nation-states, constitutionalism, and rational administration. They engineered the revolution of 1908 that forced Sultan Abdul Hamid II to restore the constitution and reconvene the parliament. For a brief, luminous moment, the constitutional revolution of 1908 seemed to promise something real. Celebrations broke out across the empire. Greeks and Armenians and Arabs and Turks embraced each other in the streets of Istanbul, celebrating what felt like a genuine new beginning. An Ottoman civic moment that might prove the Ottomanists right after all. The moment did not last. It never does. Political reality reasserted itself with brutal efficiency. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 ended the constitutional moment as definitively as anything could have. In the space of 2 years, a coalition of Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, stripped the Ottoman Empire of virtually all its remaining European territory. Territories the Ottomans had held for 5 centuries. Territories that contained some of the empire's most productive agricultural land, most of its remaining Christian population, and a significant portion of its tax base. Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, the Aegean Islands gone. In 2 years, the psychological impact on the Ottoman political class was catastrophic. Istanbul itself was nearly captured. The city of Adrianople, the second Ottoman capital, the city that Murad I had made the administrative heart of the empire's European presence, fell to Bulgarian forces. It was recovered, but the experience of nearly losing the capital to a coalition of states that had all, within living memory, been Ottoman subjects was a wound that did not heal. The Balkan Wars radicalized the Committee of Union and Progress. The idealism of 1908, the multi-ethnic constitutional vision, the Ottomanist dream, was consumed by the fires of 1912 and 1913. What emerged was harder, more desperate, and more dangerous. The CUP leadership concluded, with a logic that was coherent even as it was catastrophic, that the multi-ethnic model had failed, that minorities could not be trusted, that the empire's Christian populations had either supported or welcomed the nationalist secessions, that what remained of the empire needed to be built on a Turkish Muslim core, consolidated at whatever cost. This conclusion pointed toward policies that the pre-Tanzimat Empire, with its pragmatic tolerance and its Millet system logic of diversity as resource, would have found not just wrong, but administratively irrational. It pointed toward policies that were the precise opposite of everything that had sustained the empire for 600 years. And then, in August of 1914, the world went to war. The decision to enter World War I on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the CUP's greatest gamble and its greatest miscalculation. The logic, from their perspective, was not irrational. The Ottoman Empire faced existential pressure from Russia to the north and east, and from British and French ambitions in the Arab territories to the south. Germany was the one European great power that had no territorial ambitions in Ottoman lands, and that was actively investing in the empire's military modernization through the German military mission. A German victory would break the encirclement, relieve the Russian pressure, and perhaps recover some of the territories lost in the Balkan Wars. Germany did not win. What followed for the Ottoman Empire was 4 years of military catastrophe on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Gallipoli Campaign of 1915, in which Ottoman forces successfully repelled a massive Allied invasion, in the war's most significant Ottoman military success, could not compensate for the disasters elsewhere. The Arab Revolt, encouraged and supplied by Britain, unraveled Ottoman authority across the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. British forces advanced from Egypt through Palestine and into Syria. Russian forces pressed into Anatolia from the east before the Russian Revolution of 1917 took Russia out of the war. The empire was fighting for its life on every frontier simultaneously, with a treasury that was bankrupt, an army that was exhausted, and a civilian population that was starving. It was in this context, in the context of war, existential fear, military catastrophe, and the radicalized nationalism of a cup leadership that had abandoned every principle of Ottoman multicultural governance, that the Armenian genocide occurred. Beginning in 1915, the cup ordered the systematic deportation of the Armenian population of Anatolia. The deportations were not, in their execution, simply population transfers. They were organized mass killing. Armenian men were murdered outright. Women, children, and the elderly were driven on death marches into the Syrian desert without food, water, or shelter. Estimates of the death toll range from 600,000 to more than 1.5 million people. The full range of scholarly estimates reflects genuine uncertainty about pre-war population figures in the documentary record, not uncertainty about the fact of mass killing. The Armenian genocide was not an aberration in the Ottoman story. It was its betrayal. It was the precise inverse of the system that had sustained the empire for 600 years. The Millet logic of diversity as resource, of minority communities as stakeholders in the empire's survival, of pragmatic tolerance as governing technology. The cup replaced that logic with its opposite, with the logic of ethnic purity, of minority populations as threats rather than assets, of security through homogeneity rather than through integration. And the result was one of the 20th century's first genocides, a crime against humanity that the Republic of Turkey has officially refused to acknowledge to this day, and whose historical reality is established by the overwhelming consensus of scholars who have studied it. The genocide did not save the empire. Nothing could save the empire by 1915. The Ottoman forces surrendered in October of 1918. The armistice of Mudros ended the fighting. Allied warships sailed into the Bosphorus. British, French, and Italian troops occupied Istanbul. The Sultan became, in practical terms, a prisoner in his own palace. The empire that had resisted every external threat for 600 years had been broken at last. And it had been broken not primarily from the outside, but from the inside by the abandonment of the very principles that had made it what it was. Empires, when they die, do not simply disappear. They leave shapes in the world. Borders, populations, institutions, resentments, and unresolved questions that persist for generations, sometimes for centuries, after the political structure that created them is gone. The Ottoman Empire left more shapes than almost any other empire in modern history, because the Ottoman Empire, at its end, still governed some of the most geopolitically consequential territory on Earth. In 1916, in the middle of the war, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot had signed a secret agreement dividing anticipated Ottoman Arab territories between their two countries. The Sykes-Picot agreement drew lines across a map of the Middle East with a ruler and a pen, lines that paid no serious attention to the ethnic, religious, tribal, or geographic realities of the populations they divided, lines that split Kurdish populations across 4 different future states. Lines that put Sunni and Shia Arab populations inside the same artificial borders without the political framework to manage their differences. Lines that created Lebanon as a French mandate by carving it out of Syria. Lines that created Iraq by combining the Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra into a single entity that had never existed as a coherent political unit. The borders that Sykes and Picot drew in 1916 are, with modifications, the borders of the modern Middle East. They're the borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the territory that became the battleground of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the conflicts that have consumed those territories for the past century. The Lebanese civil war, the Iraqi sectarian violence, the Syrian civil war, the Kurdish question, the Palestinian question, all carry within them, at some structural level, the unresolved legacy of those lines drawn in the middle of a war by 2 diplomats who understood their own imperial interests better than they understood the people whose lives they were redesigning. This is not to say that all Middle Eastern conflict is simply the product of colonial borders. That would be too simple. But it is to say that understanding the modern Middle East without understanding what the Ottoman collapse left behind, and what the European powers built or failed to build in its place, is like trying to understand a building by looking only at the ground floor while ignoring the foundation. In Anatolia itself, the story took a different turn, one of the most remarkable political recoveries in the history of any civilization. Mustafa Kemal was a military officer who had distinguished himself at Gallipoli and in other campaigns. In 1919, with Allied forces occupying Istanbul and the Sultan's government effectively collaborating with the occupiers, Kemal went to Anatolia and began organizing resistance. What followed was the Turkish War of Independence, 3 years of military and diplomatic campaigning that expelled Greek forces from Western Anatolia, negotiated the departure of French forces from the south, and forced the Allied powers to renegotiate the post-war settlement on terms that recognized Turkish sovereignty over Anatolia and eastern Thrace. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 replaced the punitive Treaty of Sèvres that the Allies had imposed on the defeated Ottoman government. It established the borders of the modern Turkish state. And in October of 1923, Mustafa Kemal proclaimed the Republic of Turkey. The Sultanate had already been abolished in 1922. The Caliphate, the Ottoman Sultan's claim to the spiritual leadership of the world's Sunni Muslim community, an institution that had been one of the pillars of Ottoman legitimacy since Selim I had assumed it in 1517, was abolished in 1924. With the abolition of the Caliphate, the last institutional thread connecting the modern Turkish Republic to the Ottoman Empire was cut. The dynasty that had ruled continuously for 623 years, from Osman Bey's consolidation of power in the borderlands of northwestern Anatolia to the deposition of Mehmed VI in 1922, was finished. The empire was gone. What Kemal built in its place was deliberately, radically discontinuous with what had come before. The Turkish Republic was a nation-state, not an empire. Its identity was Turkish, not Ottoman. It was secular in its legal framework, not Islamic. It replaced the Arabic script with a Latin alphabet. It abolished the religious courts. It imposed Western dress codes. It renamed cities, replaced institutions, and undertook one of the most comprehensive programs of deliberate civilizational reinvention in the history of any state. The reinvention was real and in many ways remarkable, but it was built on the organizational capacity, the educated administrative class, the institutional knowledge, and the territorial core that 600 years of Ottoman state building had created. You cannot understand the Turkish Republic without understanding the Ottoman Empire that preceded it, any more than you can understand a river without understanding the watershed that feeds it. We have now traveled the full length of the Ottoman story. From Osman Bey on the Byzantine frontier in the early 1300s, leading a small tribal confederation with no cities, no treasury, and no obvious destiny, to the collapse of an empire in 1922 that had governed territory on 3 continents, administered dozens of languages and hundreds of ethnic communities, survived civil wars and plague and military defeat and economic crisis, and the complete restructuring of global trade. 623 years, 36 sultans, an unbroken dynastic line, the most durable empire of the modern era. So here, at the end, is the question we began with, answered not as an abstraction, but as a conclusion earned by the full weight of everything we have examined. Why 600 years? The first answer is structural design. The Ottomans, from the earliest decades of their empire, built institutions that were specifically engineered to outlast individuals. The Devshirme system produced a self-renewing elite that broke the hereditary power concentration problem. The Timur system created a provincial administrative class that was capable and motivated, but structurally prevented from becoming an independent aristocracy. The dual legal framework of Sharia and canon created a governance system flexible enough to administer extraordinary diversity without constant administrative breakdown. None of these systems were perfect. All of them eventually developed pathologies, but they worked at a functional level for longer than any comparable institutional framework in the modern era. The second answer is meritocratic elite formation. The single most consistent predictor of imperial collapse is elite calcification. The moment when the people running an empire are there because of who their parents were rather than what they can do. The Ottomans delayed that calcification for 2 centuries longer than most empires manage, through the Devshirme pipeline. When the Devshirme failed, when the Janissaries became a hereditary caste, the empire began the long process of institutional decay that eventually proved fatal. The 2-century delay bought enough time and produced enough institutional depth that the empire survived another 3 centuries after the meritocratic system broke down. That is a measure of how much structural resilience the original design had created. The third answer is multicultural administrative pragmatism. The Millet system was not perfect pluralism. It was not modern liberalism. It was a governing technology, a set of institutional arrangements that turned religious and ethnic diversity from a source of instability into a source of administrative efficiency and economic vitality. It preserved the cultures of dozens of communities across centuries, not out of benevolence, but because preserving those communities served the empire's operational interests. And in serving those interests, it produced, as a byproduct, one of the most culturally diverse and intellectually productive civilizational spaces in human history. The Ottoman Empire at its peak was, by any objective measure, more tolerant of human diversity than any contemporary European state. Not because it was morally superior, but because its governing logic required it to be. The fourth answer is diplomatic intelligence. The Ottomans understood, across multiple generations of statesmen, that military power is not the only form of power. They used European rivalries as a buffer. They calibrated their relationships with European powers to prevent the formation of unified coalitions against them. They deployed the capitulations as diplomatic tools before they became economic vulnerabilities. They used the Tanzimat reforms as leverage in European public opinion at a moment when that opinion mattered to great power decision-making. They played a weak hand, a weakening hand, with a sophistication and a consistency that extended the empire's functional life by decades beyond what raw power could have sustained. Now compare these 4 pillars to the empires that failed faster. Rome built extraordinary institutions, but could not solve the hereditary succession problem, the elite calcification problem, or the loyalty of a professional army that knew it could make and unmake emperors. The Mongols were militarily unparalleled, but built almost no governing institutions beyond the capacity for organized violence. And when the violence stopped producing expansion, there was nothing else to hold the structure together. The British Empire built remarkable institutions, commanded extraordinary naval and commercial power, and governed a quarter of the earth. But it built its imperial identity on racial hierarchy rather than pragmatic inclusion, which meant it could not integrate its diverse populations into a shared stake in the empire's survival. When the ideology of racial hierarchy became politically unsustainable in the 20th century, the justification for the empire dissolved with it. The Ottomans were not better people than the Romans or the Mongols or the British. They committed atrocities. They perpetuated injustices. They ended, in their final decade, with a genocide that was the precise betrayal of everything their system had been built on. No empire in human history has a clean moral ledger, and the Ottoman Empire is not an exception. But they built something, a system, a set of institutional arrangements, a governing philosophy that was, in its structural logic, more durable than anything comparable in the modern era. And that durability was not accidental, not the product of fortune or geography alone, not the gift of a single great leader. It was the product of deliberate design, consistently applied, intelligently adapted, and sustained across 6 centuries of changing circumstances by an institution that understood, better than any other empire of its time, the single most important truth about power. Power that depends on domination alone is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. It produces resistance. It exhausts itself. Power that is organized, that is embedded in institutions, distributed through meritocratic systems, adapted to serve the interests of diverse populations, and sustained by the loyalty of people who have a genuine stake in the system's survival. That kind of power is something else entirely. That kind of power can last 600 years. And when it finally ended, when the Ottoman Empire took its last breath in 1922, when Mehmed VI sailed away from Istanbul on a British warship and the 623-year dynasty closed, it left behind not just the borders and the conflicts and the unresolved questions that we're still living with today. It left behind a record, a demonstration, imperfect and complicated and human in all its contradictions, of what organized, adaptive, institutionally sophisticated governance can actually achieve over the full span of human time. No empire since has come close. None has lasted as long, governed as much diversity, or adapted as consistently to as many structural challenges. The Ottoman Empire was, in the end, the answer to a question that every civilization is always asking. The question of how human beings, different from each other in language and faith and custom and history, can be held together in a single functioning political community long enough for something genuinely great to be built. The Ottomans held it together for 600 years. That answer deserves to be understood. It deserves to be studied. It deserves, at the very least, to be remembered. And if this story has stayed with you, if it has shifted something in how you understand the sweep of human civilization and the extraordinary, fragile, hard-won institutions that hold it together, then share it. Pass it on. Because the most powerful thing any documentary can do is not to inform a single viewer, but to start a conversation that spreads beyond this screen and into the world. If this story earned that from you, like it, share it, and stay with us, because the human story is long, and we are only getting started.